The moment people stop fearing you, they finally begin showing you who they really are. I learned that lesson because of a single unexpected slap. Rain had a way of making Boston feel quieter than it really was. The streets shimmered beneath amber streetlights, and every passing car left ribbons of water across the pavement. My black SUV rolled to a smooth stop outside a private charity gala where politicians, executives, and donors had spent the evening pretending generosity came naturally. They all shook my hand. They all smiled. None of them dared meet my eyes for more than a second. That was the life I had built. Respect purchased with influence. Silence reinforced by reputation. My name traveled into every room before I did, and most conversations ended the moment I arrived. I stepped onto the wet sidewalk, buttoning my charcoal overcoat against the cold October wind. Anthony, my head of security, scanned every corner without saying a word. My team formed their usual invisible circle around me. Years of discipline had made their movements almost mechanical. Everything happened exactly as planned until fate decided to interrupt. A young woman hurried out of the community arts center across the street, folding a white cane against her coat as another pedestrian accidentally bumped into her shoulder. She stumbled sideways. Instinct took over before reason could catch up. She reached toward the nearest solid object to steady herself. That object happened to be me. Our shoulders collided. Startled by the unexpected contact, she gasped, turned toward the sound of my footsteps, and her open hand struck my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed louder than the traffic. Time stopped. My security team froze. A nearby valet dropped a set of car keys. Even the conversations outside the gala dissolved into stunned silence. No one moved. No one breathed. They all waited for me. Slowly, I turned my face back toward the woman standing only a few feet away. She looked completely unaware of who I was. Her pale blue eyes faced my direction, but never truly focused. They carried that distant softness I had seen only once before in a military hospital years earlier. She was blind. Her breathing became uneven. "I am so sorry," she whispered immediately. "Someone pushed into me, I thought." Her voice trailed away as her folded cane slipped from trembling fingers and tapped against the wet concrete. She crouched carefully, searching for it with both hands. Anthony leaned toward me. "Sir, just give the word." His voice remained calm, but every man beside him had already prepared for whatever came next. I looked at the frightened young woman instead. She found the cane, stood slowly, and bowed her head. "Please forgive me," she said again. "I did not mean to hurt anyone." There was no fear of my reputation because she did not know it existed. There was only honest regret. Somehow that unsettled me far more than defiance ever could. Most people apologized because they recognized my face. She apologized because she believed it was the right thing to do. I studied her for another long moment while rain collected on the shoulders of my coat. She had no expensive jewelry, no designer handbag, no bodyguard, nothing except quiet dignity standing alone in the middle of a crowded sidewalk. Every instinct I had developed over 15 years told me to walk away. Another voice inside me, one I had ignored for far too long, quietly insisted otherwise. I looked toward Anthony without taking my eyes off the woman. "Find out who she is," I said. "No intimidation, no threats. No one frightens her. I want every detail about her life by tomorrow morning." Anthony frowned. "Is this revenge?" I watched the blind girl disappear slowly into the rain, tapping her cane with calm determination despite everything that had just happened. A faint smile crossed my face before I answered. "That is exactly what I intend." At that moment, I believed I was about to teach a stranger the price of crossing Vincent Moretti. I had no idea she was about to teach me the value of becoming someone entirely different. The next morning the rain had disappeared, but the sound of that single unexpected moment still echoed inside my head. I sat alone in my office on the 42nd floor overlooking Boston Harbor while the first light of sunrise reflected across the water. My desk held contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 3 executives were waiting downstairs for a meeting they had requested months earlier. My assistant had already reminded me twice that my schedule was completely full. None of it held my attention. Anthony entered exactly at 8 o'clock, carrying a slim black folder. He placed it in front of me without speaking. He already knew I would read every page. I opened it slowly. Grace Carter, 27 years old. Blind for 6 years after rescuing a little girl during a warehouse fire that had spread through an after-school program. She lived alone in a modest apartment less than 2 miles from the community arts center. She taught beginner piano lessons, volunteered with children who had disabilities, and spent every Thursday helping senior citizens learn adaptive technology. There were no expensive vacations, no luxury purchases, no hidden scandals, no wealthy relatives. Anthony folded his hands behind his back. We checked everything twice. She is exactly who she appears to be. I continued reading. Medical bills had nearly emptied her savings after the accident. She had refused several public fundraising campaigns because she did not want strangers to feel obligated to support her. Instead, she worked 2 part-time jobs until the community arts center hired her full-time. I closed the folder more slowly than I had opened it. Who visits her? I asked. Mostly neighbors, parents of her students, volunteers. Everyone speaks highly of her. Anthony hesitated before adding one final sentence. No one has ever described her as difficult. I leaned back in my chair, staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Revenge had sounded simple the night before. Now it felt strangely childish. Still, I was not ready to admit that. Cancel my lunch meeting, I said. Anthony raised an eyebrow. You are going to see her. I am going to understand her. Less than an hour later, I parked half a block away from the community arts center in an ordinary gray sedan instead of my usual convoy. No security surrounded me. No tailored overcoat announced my arrival. I wanted to observe without changing the atmosphere around her. Through the front window, I saw Grace sitting beside an upright piano while 5 children laughed around her. She could not see their smiles, yet somehow she smiled at exactly the right moments. One little boy struck the wrong key and immediately apologized. Grace laughed softly. Do you know why mistakes are beautiful? She asked. The children shook their heads. Because they remind us we are still learning. The room grew quiet. Even I forgot why I had come. After the lesson ended, the children rushed outside while Grace carefully stacked music books by touch. As she walked toward the entrance, an elderly man struggled to hold the door open while balancing 2 grocery bags. Before anyone else noticed, Grace reached the doorway, set her cane against the wall, and gently took one of the bags from his arm. Let me help, she said with an easy smile. The man thanked her 3 different times before they disappeared down the sidewalk together. I remained standing across the street, watching the woman I had planned to punish spend her afternoon making someone else's day easier. The strange feeling inside me returned, stronger than before. I had expected to find weakness. Instead, I found quiet strength. I had expected an opportunity for revenge. Instead, I found myself searching for a reason to come back tomorrow. The following afternoon, I convinced myself I was only satisfying my curiosity. That was the lie I repeated during the entire drive across the city. I ignored 3 phone calls from board members waiting for my approval on a major acquisition and silenced another from my attorney. None of those conversations felt as urgent as the quiet woman who had somehow occupied every empty corner of my thoughts. I parked near the community arts center once again and crossed the street with a paper cup of black coffee warming my hands against the cool autumn air. Inside, children's laughter echoed through the hallway, mixing with the soft notes of a piano drifting from one of the classrooms. I paused outside the open door. Grace sat beside a little girl whose tiny fingers hesitated above the piano keys. Do not worry about playing perfectly, Grace said gently. Play honestly. People remember how music makes them feel, not how many notes you played correctly. The little girl nodded and tried again. This time the melody stumbled only once before finding its rhythm. Grace smiled immediately. There it is. Did you hear the difference? Yes, the child answered proudly. I stopped being scared. Grace laughed softly. Exactly. I realized she was not simply teaching children how to play music. She was teaching them how to trust themselves. When the lesson ended, the parents thanked her before leading their children outside. I stepped into the room just as she finished placing the sheet music back inside a cabinet. She tilted her head slightly toward the sound of my footsteps. I know that walk, she said with an easy smile. You came back. I could not help smiling in return. You recognize people that quickly? Not everyone. Just the ones who think before every step. I looked down at the polished hardwood floor, almost amused by how accurately she had described me. That obvious? Only if someone listens. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Finally, she asked, Would you mind helping me carry a few boxes to the reading room? I picked up 2 containers filled with donated books while she walked beside me, lightly tracing the wall with her fingertips whenever the hallway turned. She never reached for my arm. She never asked me to guide her. She had built her own confidence one careful step at a time. After we placed the boxes on a shelf, she thanked me with genuine warmth. You have been very kind these last couple of days. The words landed heavier than she could have imagined. Kind was not how people usually described Vincent Moretti. Powerful, influential, intimidating, successful. Those words followed me everywhere. Kind never did. I am only returning a favor, I replied. She frowned slightly. What favor? You reminded me that people deserve patience. She smiled, clearly unsure what I meant. Life has been patient with me. I should return the favor whenever I can. Before I could answer, an elderly volunteer entered carrying a box that was obviously too heavy for him. Without hesitation, Grace walked toward the sound of his breathing and steadied the box before he could lose his balance. We will carry it together, she said. Not I will carry it. Now you should let me help. Together. That single word stayed with me long after the box reached its destination. For years I had believed strength meant standing above everyone else. Grace quietly believed strength meant standing beside someone instead. As I watched her thank the volunteer for allowing her to help, I realized something that unsettled me more than the slap ever had. She had already begun changing the way I saw the world, and she had absolutely no idea she was doing it. Over the next several days, I developed a routine I would never have admitted to anyone. Every afternoon, after meetings that seemed less important than they once had, I found myself driving toward the community arts center instead of returning to my office. I always told Anthony I wanted to observe. I told myself I was gathering answers before deciding how to settle an old score. The truth was becoming much harder to ignore. I simply wanted to hear Grace's voice again. That Tuesday, the air carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh coffee drifting from a small cafe across the street. Children hurried inside wearing oversized backpacks while parents exchanged quick conversations before rushing back to work. Grace stood near the entrance greeting each family by name. She recognized them by their footsteps, their voices, even the little habits most people never noticed. One father apologized for arriving late. Grace smiled gently. You made it. That is what matters. A nervous little boy admitted he had forgotten to practice piano all week. Instead of disappointment, she laughed softly. Then today is a wonderful day to begin again. No lectures. No judgment. Just another chance. I wondered how different my own life might have been if someone had spoken to me that way years ago. I stepped inside carrying a paper bag from the bakery next door. I thought your students might enjoy these after class, I said. Grace turned toward my voice and smiled immediately. You remembered they love blueberry muffins. I hesitated. I suppose I did. She accepted the bag with both hands. Thank you, Vincent. Hearing my first name spoken with such simple warmth felt strangely unfamiliar. Around Grace, I was never Mr. Moretti. I was never someone people feared. I was only Vincent. The afternoon passed quietly as I helped arrange chairs before a reading session. Parents thanked me without asking who I was. Volunteers handed me boxes to carry as though I had been part of the center for years. No one treated me differently because no one knew the life I returned to every evening. For the first time in a long while, anonymity felt peaceful instead of inconvenient. When the last family left, Grace sat beside the piano, lightly running her fingertips across the polished wood. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. What do you do when you are not rescuing music books and carrying heavy boxes? I almost laughed. No reporter had ever asked me a question that difficult. I manage several businesses, I answered carefully. She nodded. That explains why you always sound tired. Do I? You carry silence the way other people carry briefcases. I looked at her in complete surprise. She could not see my expression, yet somehow she understood me better than executives who had worked beside me for years. Is that a bad thing? I asked quietly. She thought for a moment before answering. Not bad. Just lonely. The words settled heavily inside my chest. Lonely. People assumed wealth erased loneliness. Influence erased loneliness. Power erased loneliness. They were wrong. Some of the quietest rooms I had ever entered were the ones filled with people trying to impress me. Grace stood slowly and unfolded her white cane. Would you walk with me to the bus stop? She asked. We stepped outside into the cool afternoon sunlight. moving at an easy pace beneath trees glowing with shades of gold and red. She never reached for my arm, only listened to the rhythm of my footsteps beside hers. After several minutes, she smiled. You know something? What? The first day we met, your footsteps sounded heavy. Today they sound lighter. I did not know how to explain that the difference had begun the moment she entered my life. Instead, I simply matched my pace to hers and wondered when my search for revenge had quietly become the part of every day I looked forward to the most. The more time I spent around Grace, the less certain I became about the man I saw in the mirror each morning. My life had always been measured by numbers, negotiations, and carefully planned decisions. Hers was measured by conversations, music lessons, and the quiet joy of helping someone else find confidence. Somehow, her world felt richer than mine despite containing so much less. A week passed before I realized I had started arranging my schedule around the hours she taught at the Community Arts Center. Anthony noticed it before I admitted it to myself. You canceled another afternoon meeting, he said as we left my office one Thursday. That makes 4 this week. I slipped my hands into the pockets of my coat. Reschedule them. He looked at me thoughtfully. You have never rescheduled your life for anyone before. I did not answer because I knew he was right. By the time I reached the center, the building was unusually quiet. Instead of music, I heard soft conversations drifting from one of the classrooms. Grace was leading a reading session for adults who had recently lost their vision. I remained outside the open door, listening instead of interrupting. One elderly man sighed heavily. Everything feels impossible now, he admitted. I cannot even pour a cup of coffee without making a mess. Grace smiled with the calm confidence I had come to admire. Then tomorrow you will spill a little less than today. A woman sitting beside him laughed quietly. What if I never get better? Grace folded her hands together before answering. You already are. You came here instead of giving up at home. Sometimes courage looks much smaller than people expect. The room fell silent. No speech could have sounded more powerful. She was not giving people false hope. She was teaching them how to build real hope one ordinary day at a time. After the session ended, the students thanked her before slowly making their way toward the hallway. Grace recognized my footsteps immediately. Vincent, she asked with a warm smile. How long have you been standing there? Long enough to realize you are changing more lives than you probably know. She laughed softly. I only remind people they are stronger than they think. We walked into the courtyard where colorful autumn leaves drifted across the brick pathway. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Grace tilted her face toward the sky as though she could feel the sunlight resting there. May I ask you something? She said. Anything. Why do you keep coming back? The question stopped me completely. For several seconds I searched for an answer that sounded convincing. At first I had come because my pride demanded it. Then curiosity had replaced anger. Somewhere along the way, neither explanation remained true. Because I enjoy being here, I finally admitted. She smiled gently. No. I blinked. No. You enjoy feeling different here. I stared at her, unable to deny it. She continued walking with slow, confident steps. Out there, people probably expect something from you all the time. Here, no one expects anything except kindness. Her words uncovered a truth I had spent years avoiding. Every relationship in my world had been built on influence, obligation, or negotiation. No one at the Community Arts Center wanted anything from Vincent Moretti because no one knew who Vincent Moretti really was. They only knew a quiet man willing to carry books, arrange chairs, and listen. As Grace smiled toward the sound of children laughing somewhere across the courtyard, I realized the greatest gift she had given me was not forgiveness for an accident. She had given me a place where I could exist without the weight of the life I had spent so many years protecting. The following Monday began with a phone call that should have been routine, yet it quietly changed the direction of my day. Anthony entered my office carrying several reports before placing one newspaper clipping on top of the stack. The Community Arts Center postponed its winter concert, he said. I looked up immediately. Why? The roof needs repairs before the first heavy snowfall. They are trying to raise the money through donations and volunteer events. I picked up the article. The building where Grace spent nearly every afternoon helping children, seniors, and families had survived for decades, but time had finally begun to leave its mark. The director had refused to cancel programs, choosing instead to place buckets beneath small leaks whenever it rained. I stared at the photograph for a long moment before setting it back on the desk. My first instinct was simple. Write a check. Solve the problem before lunchtime. That was how I had handled every obstacle for years. Money arrived. Problems disappeared. Yet Grace had already taught me that solving a problem was not always the same as helping people. Do nothing yet, I told Anthony. He looked genuinely surprised. Nothing. Not directly. That afternoon, I visited the center as usual. Grace was sitting with 3 young students around a large table covered in art supplies. They were building tiny cardboard houses for a neighborhood display. One little girl accidentally crushed part of her project and immediately looked ready to cry. Grace reached across the table and gently touched the child's hand. "Do you know my favorite part about making something?" she asked. The little girl shook her head. "Nothing has to stay broken if you are willing to build again." Together, they carefully reshaped the little cardboard house until it looked even better than before. I watched from the doorway, quietly realizing she was never really talking about crafts. She was always talking about people. When the children left, Grace turned toward me with the familiar smile that somehow greeted me before I ever spoke. "Your footsteps sound thoughtful today," she said. I laughed softly. "Can footsteps really sound thoughtful?" "Yours can." We carried folding chairs back into storage after an afternoon reading program. The room smelled of old books, fresh coffee, and polished wood. Volunteers chatted happily in the hallway while parents gathered their children outside. It felt less like a building and more like a family. "The director seems worried," I said carefully. Grace nodded. "He is trying not to show it." "About the roof?" "About disappointing everyone if we cannot raise enough money." She rested her hand lightly against the back of a chair before continuing. "This place gave many people a second chance. We all want to protect it." I hesitated before asking. "If someone offered to pay for everything tomorrow, would you accept?" She became quiet for several seconds. "Only if they wanted to support the community instead of owning it." Her answer stayed with me all evening. After returning to my office, I called the chairman of a charitable foundation my company had quietly supported for years. "I want you to announce a community partnership," I said. "Every dollar the neighborhood raises for the Arts Center will be matched 3-1 through the foundation. Keep my name completely out of it." The chairman sounded confused. "You do not want any recognition?" I looked through the window toward the city lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky. "Recognition is not the point." The next morning, volunteers doubled. Local businesses donated supplies. Families organized concerts, bake sales, and book drives. Everyone believed their own efforts had inspired a generous foundation to join them. Standing quietly across the street, I watched Grace smile as neighbors celebrated together. And for the first time in my life, I understood that the greatest kind of generosity was the one that allowed other people to feel proud of what they had accomplished themselves. Several weeks passed, and without realizing it, I had begun measuring time differently. My calendar no longer revolved around board meetings or investment reports. Instead, I remembered days by the conversations I had shared with Grace, the songs I had heard drifting through the music room, and the quiet moments that somehow carried more meaning than every expensive celebration I had ever attended. Anthony noticed the change before anyone else. One evening, as we left another meeting that had stretched far longer than necessary, he glanced at me while the driver pulled onto the highway. "You have been different lately." I looked out the window where the city lights reflected across the Charles River. "Different how?" "You listen more than you speak." I smiled faintly. "Is that a problem?" He shook his head. "No, I just never expected to see it." Neither had I. The next afternoon, I arrived at the Community Arts Center to find volunteers repainting the hallway walls while parents assembled new bookshelves donated by a local business. Children carried small paintbrushes with enormous determination, proudly covering tiny corners they had been trusted to finish. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to contribute. No one was there because they had been instructed. They came because they wanted to belong. Grace stood near the entrance welcoming every volunteer by name. She thanked each person with the same warmth whether they donated an hour of work or an entire truckload of supplies. There was no difference in the value she placed on generosity. When she heard my footsteps, her face brightened immediately. "Vincent, I was hoping you would come today." Those simple words stayed with me far longer than they should have. Very few people had ever hoped to see me. Most simply expected me. "How can I help?" I asked. She handed me a box filled with children's books waiting to be sorted onto newly repaired shelves. "You are becoming very reliable," she said with a quiet laugh. "That is a compliment I have not heard before." Then someone should have said it years ago. We spent the next hour arranging books together while volunteers chatted around us. An elderly carpenter carefully adjusted a bookshelf that leaned slightly to one side. A high school student swept sawdust from the floor without anyone asking. Two little brothers proudly carried one chair at a time across the room, as though they were moving priceless treasure. Every person contributed something different, yet every effort mattered equally. Grace paused beside one of the shelves and ran her fingertips across the raised labels marking each section. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened carefully. Hammers tapped gently in another room. Children laughed somewhere down the hallway. Someone tested a piano, letting a few bright notes float through the building. "It sounds busy," I answered. She smiled. "It sounds like people believing this place has a future." I looked around the room with fresh eyes. Weeks earlier, I would have measured success by the value of the renovations. Grace measured it by the number of hearts willing to build them together. Before leaving, the center director gathered everyone into the main hall to thank the volunteers. He spoke about kindness, generosity, and neighbors helping neighbors. Not once did he mention the foundation providing matching funds because, in his mind, the real miracle had been the community itself. As applause filled the room, Grace quietly leaned toward me. "Do you know what my favorite part is?" she whispered. "What?" "No one is waiting for someone else to save them anymore." I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest because I finally understood what she meant. For most of my life, I believed leadership meant standing in front while everyone else followed. Grace had shown me something far greater. Real leadership quietly inspired ordinary people to discover the goodness that had been inside them all along. And as I watched the smiles filling that once struggling building, I realized the woman who could not see the world had somehow helped everyone around her see it more clearly, including me. By the time December arrived, the Community Arts Center no longer looked like the struggling building I had first discovered on a rainy evening months before. Fresh paint brightened every hallway. New lights warmed the classrooms after sunset. The repaired roof stood ready for another New England winter, and the piano in the music room had finally been restored to perfect condition. Yet the greatest transformation had nothing to do with walls or windows. It had happened inside me. One cold afternoon, I arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee from the little cafe across the street. Grace smiled the moment she heard my footsteps crossing the wooden floor. "You remembered," she said as I placed the warm cup into her hands. "Extra cinnamon," I replied. She laughed softly. "You pay attention to small things." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "You taught me they are never small." We carried our coffee into the courtyard where the last golden leaves clung stubbornly to the old maple trees. Volunteers were decorating the entrance with handmade wreaths while children rehearsed holiday songs inside the music room. Their voices drifted through the open windows, filling the crisp afternoon air with a happiness that felt almost unfamiliar to someone like me. Grace sat beside me on a weathered wooden bench and tilted her face toward the winter sunlight. "Everyone seems excited," she said. "They should be," I answered. "They built something worth celebrating." She nodded slowly. "People become stronger when they realize they are needed." Her words lingered between us while we listened to the distant sound of piano keys echoing through the building. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Vincent, may I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why do I feel as though you have been carrying a secret since the day we met?" My heartbeat slowed. I had spent weeks convincing myself that the truth could wait a little longer. Suddenly, it no longer felt fair to let her continue trusting someone she did not fully know. "Because I have," I admitted quietly. She remained perfectly calm. "Does it frighten you?" I smiled without realizing it. "More than any business meeting I have ever attended." Grace rested both hands around her coffee cup before speaking. "Secrets become heavier the longer we carry them." I looked toward the community center where families laughed together while hanging decorations across the front entrance. For the first time in many years, I wanted someone to know the real man standing behind the carefully constructed image the world had always seen. "When we first met," I began slowly, "I was not looking for friendship." She listened without interrupting. "I believed you had embarrassed me in front of people who expected me to be respected. I intended to teach you a lesson." A gentle smile appeared on her face instead of the disappointment I had expected. I wondered if something like that might be true. I stared at her in surprise. "You did?" She nodded. You sounded angry that first day. Then every time you returned, your voice became a little softer. I let out a quiet breath. You were never afraid of me. She laughed softly. How could I fear someone who always carried books for children and remembered exactly how I take my coffee? Her answer left me completely speechless. She had judged me only by my actions, never by the image I believed the world saw. As the afternoon sun slowly settled behind the rooftops, I realized the confession I feared most had not pushed her away. Instead, it had quietly removed the final wall standing between the man I used to be and the man I finally wanted to become. Snow began falling just before sunset on the evening of the community winter concert. Soft white flakes drifted across the sidewalks, settling quietly on rooftops and bare tree branches until the entire neighborhood seemed wrapped in peaceful silence. I stood across the street for a moment, watching families hurry toward the brightly lit entrance of the community arts center. Children carried sheet music against their coats while parents laughed about the weather. Months earlier, I would have driven past a place like this without ever noticing it. Tonight it felt like the only place in the city that truly mattered. Inside, every seat was filled. The repaired building glowed with warmth, music, and conversations that sounded more like family than neighbors. I remained near the back of the room, exactly where I preferred to stand. Grace moved carefully across the stage, greeting every child before the performance began. She could not see their smiling faces, yet somehow she knew exactly who needed encouragement, whose hands were shaking with nervous excitement, and who simply needed someone to remind them to breathe. The concert was not perfect. A few notes arrived too early. One little boy forgot part of the melody before finding it again with a shy smile. The audience applauded louder after every song because no one had gathered there to witness perfection. They had come to celebrate courage. When the final note faded, the room rose together in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Grace thanked every volunteer, every teacher, every parent, and every child before quietly reminding them that kindness only mattered when it continued after the applause ended. As families slowly made their way outside into the falling snow, I remained behind. The building gradually became quiet until only the sound of distant laughter echoed through the empty hallway. Grace stepped into the music room, gently closing the piano lid before turning toward me. I knew you were still here, she said with a peaceful smile. How? I asked. She laughed softly. Your footsteps always wait until everyone else leaves. I walked closer, stopping beside the old piano where our conversations had begun so many weeks before. There is one more truth I owe you, I said. She listened without interrupting. The man you met that rainy night was someone who believed respect could only be earned through fear. I spent years convincing the world to stay one careful step away from me. Then one accident placed you in my path. Grace remained silent, giving my words room to breathe. I thought I was planning revenge, I continued. Instead, every day I spent beside you became another reason to become someone I had forgotten was possible. A gentle smile spread across her face. Vincent, may I tell you what I think? Please. I do not believe people change because someone tells them to. I think they change when they finally meet the person they were always capable of becoming. I lowered my eyes, feeling the weight of those words settle somewhere deep inside me. For the first time in my life, I understood that strength had never been about controlling a room or protecting a reputation. It was about having the courage to become honest after years of hiding behind power. Grace reached out until her hand found mine. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only quiet trust. Do you remember the first day we met? She asked. I smiled. I remember every second. She laughed. I accidentally slapped a stranger. I shook my head gently. No. She tilted her head with curiosity. Then what happened? I looked through the window as snow continued falling across the peaceful street where everything had begun. A remarkable woman found a man who had forgotten how to live, and without ever trying, she gave him back the part of himself that money, influence, and success could never buy. She smiled, and although she had never seen my face, I felt more understood in that moment than I ever had in my entire life. As we stepped outside together into the quiet winter evening, I realized the greatest revenge had never belonged to me at all. It belonged to the blind girl who answered pride with kindness, replaced fear with trust, and quietly transformed the heart of the man who once believed the world could only be ruled from the shadows.